The recruits marched through the mud of a January morning without knowing their destination. They had left their villages days ago, some from the Loire Valley, others from Brittany, a few from the outskirts of Paris, carrying little more than a rolled blanket and a name written on a conscription list. They were bakers, farmhands, apprentices, the younger sons of families who had never expected war to knock on their door. But France in the early years of the 19th century was not a country where war knocked. It was a country where war was built, deliberately, systematically, with a precision no kingdom in Europe had ever attempted before. What Napoleon understood from the very beginning was that the old way of fighting was already dead. The armies of other European powers still moved as they had for 100 years. Vast, cumbersome masses of professional soldiers who marched together, ate together, depended on the same wagons, the same roads, the same slow supply chains that stretched back for miles. A single bad river crossing could paralyze 30,000 men for days. Napoleon looked at that model and dismissed it entirely. What he built in its place was something Europe had never seen. Not merely a larger army, but a different kind of machine, one built for speed, for shock, and for the complete destruction of an enemy before it had time to recover. The foundation of everything was the conscript. Before the revolution, armies belonged to kings. The soldiers who filled European ranks were professionals, mercenaries, men bound by contract or desperation. When they died, they were expensive to replace. When they deserted, nothing ideological held them back. The revolution changed that calculation with sudden and total violence. The decree of August 1793 declared that every able body in France was, from that moment forward, a resource of the state. Young men would fight. Married men would forge weapons and transport supplies. Women would make tents and tend to the wounded. Children would scrape old linen into bandages. The elderly would stand in public squares and urge courage into those about to leave. An entire nation had been conscripted into a single war effort, and the soldier it produced carried something no mercenary ever had: a reason. By the time Napoleon consolidated power, that revolutionary energy had been refined into a system. Men between 18 and 25 were required to register. They were sorted, assessed, assigned. Exemptions existed. A missing thumb made a man unable to tear open a cartridge with his teeth, and so he was released. Certain industrial workers deemed essential were spared. But for the vast majority of young Frenchmen, military service was simply the next chapter of their life. Over the course of the empire, France conscripted more than 2.5 million men. At its peak, the Grande Armée fielded nearly 600,000 soldiers in a single campaign. No monarch in European history had ever commanded a force of that scale, and the scale itself changed what war could accomplish. But numbers without structure are merely chaos in uniform. Napoleon knew that the critical problem of a massive army was not how to fill it, it was how to move it. Traditional armies that marched as one body were slaves to their own weight. They consumed everything around them, stripped the countryside bare within days, and then ground to a halt waiting for wagons to catch up. The innovation that changed this entirely was the corps system. Napoleon divided his army into independent corps, self-contained fighting forces of between 20 and 30,000 men, each with its own infantry, cavalry, and artillery, each capable of fighting alone for a day or two until reinforcements arrived. These corps marched on separate roads, spread across the countryside, foraging as they went, never exhausting a single region, never choking a single road. Then, at the moment of battle, they converged, and the enemy, who had been watching one column, suddenly found itself surrounded by several. The speed this produced was almost incomprehensible to opposing generals. A Napoleonic corps could cover 30 miles in a single day, and did, repeatedly, campaign after campaign. In the autumn of 1805, Napoleon moved his entire army from the Channel coast to the Rhine and then deep into Austria in just 63 days. Austrian commanders, expecting the slow, deliberate advance of an 18th century force, found French soldiers already behind them before they had finished drawing their battle plans. At Ulm, an entire Austrian army of 40,000 men was encircled and forced to surrender without a major engagement. They had not been defeated by superior numbers. They had been outpaced. The machine had simply moved faster than their imagination allowed for. At the heart of every engagement was the artillery, and Napoleon treated it with a reverence that bordered on obsession. He had trained as a gunner, had won his earliest reputation through the precise placement of cannon, and he never forgot what artillery could do when handled with intelligence rather than instinct. The guns his army carried had been standardized by reforms introduced decades earlier. Lighter barrels, interchangeable parts, uniform calibers that meant ammunition captured from the Austrians could be loaded directly into French cannon without modification. When the Grande Armée defeated Austria in 1805, it confiscated enough 6-pound munitions to resupply its own batteries without drawing from French depots. The enemy had, quite literally, been made to pay for their own destruction. What Napoleon perfected was the use of massed artillery as a surgical instrument. Before a major assault, he would concentrate dozens of guns, sometimes 100 or more, against a single point in the enemy line. Not to destroy it entirely, but to shatter its cohesion, to kill enough men and break enough formations that the section became psychologically as well as physically vulnerable. Then came the infantry columns, moving fast, moving close, followed by the cavalry that punched through whatever the guns had broken. The sequence was deliberate and practiced until it operated almost without orders. At Austerlitz in December 1805, this coordination reached its most perfect expression, the most celebrated tactical victory of the age, executed against the combined armies of Austria and Russia, won in a single afternoon. The officer who led a French corps or division in those years was a different creature from his counterpart in any other European army. In the old order, rank had followed blood. A nobleman's son received his commission the way he received his inheritance, automatically, by right of birth, regardless of ability. Napoleon abolished that logic completely. Promotion in the Grande Armée moved through demonstrated competence, through courage visible on the battlefield, through the kind of leadership that soldiers actually followed into fire. The result was an officer corps unlike anything Europe had encountered. Men who had genuinely earned their positions, who understood war from the inside because many had once stood in the same mud as the men they now commanded. It was said at the time that every common soldier carried a marshal's baton in his knapsack, and the astonishing fact was that this was almost true. Several of Napoleon's marshals had begun their careers as ordinary men in the ranks. The marshals themselves became the operational nervous system of the machine. Napoleon could not be everywhere. He knew that, and so he created men who carried his intentions inside them well enough to act without him. Alexandre Berthier, his chief of staff, ran the logistics of campaigns that moved hundreds of thousands of men across entire countries, translating Napoleon's broad strategic intentions into specific timed orders for every corps, every division, every column on every road. Berthier tracked supply levels, march routes, the condition of roads, the location of bridges, the depth of rivers. Without him, the machine's speed would have been impossible. Napoleon knew it. He referred to Berthier in terms that a craftsman might use about his finest tool. The army fed itself in ways that would have scandalized earlier commanders. Rather than depending on wagon trains laboriously loaded at French depots and dragged across half of Europe, Napoleon's corps were expected to live largely off the land they marched through. Soldiers requisitioned food from local populations. In practice, this often meant taking it. Stripped farms, commandeered cattle, seized whatever the countryside offered. It was brutal for the civilians who encountered it, and it created resentments that would later fuel resistance movements in Spain and elsewhere. But as a logistical solution, it was devastatingly effective. An army that did not carry its own food supply could move at a speed that an army weighted with provision wagons simply could not match. The core system made this possible because the unit spread out enough that no single region was stripped bare in hours. The young men who entered this machine were shaped by it in ways they had not anticipated. They arrived as farmhands and apprentices and left as soldiers who had marched through Italy, Egypt, Prussia, Poland, Portugal. The regimental system built fierce loyalties that Napoleon understood and deliberately cultivated. Each regiment carried its history like a living thing, its battle honors, its legends, its particular identity within the larger army. The soldier did not fight for France in the abstract. He fought for his regiment, for the men beside him, for the eagle standard that his unit had carried through campaigns that had become the substance of his memory. Napoleon moved through the camps before major battles, calling men by name, stopping to speak with veterans, creating the sensation, the carefully manufactured sensation, that he knew each one personally. The effect on morale was profound and entirely calculated. The Imperial Guard sat at the center of all this, as something beyond an elite unit. It was a symbol made of flesh. Entry required a minimum of 10 years of service and at least 2 campaign wounds. The average guardsman was not young. He was weathered, scarred, and fully formed as a soldier by years of war that would have broken most men. Napoleon almost never committed the Guard to battle. He held it as his final reserve, as the visible proof that something remained unspent, that he had not yet shown everything he had. Enemy commanders knew the Guard existed, knew it had never been defeated in a major engagement, and that knowledge sat in their minds during every battle like an unanswered question. At Austerlitz, at Jena, at Wagram, the Guard waited. The psychological weight of a force that had not yet moved was, in itself, a weapon. Behind the fighting force ran a machine of production that France had never operated before. The arms manufactories at Charleville, Saint-Étienne, and a dozen other sites turned out muskets at rates that the old royal workshops would have considered impossible. Cannon foundries at Douai and Le Creusot worked continuously. The sword manufactory in Klingenthal, in Alsace, employed over 600 workers at its peak, producing blades at a pace calibrated to the army's consumption. Everything was standardized: calibers, parts, dimensions, so that a musket produced in one factory could be repaired with components from another, so that a broken cannon carriage could be rebuilt from spare parts carried in a dedicated wagon, rather than abandoned on the roadside. This standardization was not an accident. It was the deliberate application of a logic that Napoleon had taken from the Revolution and refined into an industrial principle of war. The propaganda that ran through this machine was as carefully engineered as the cannons. Soldiers carried with them not just weapons, but an identity. They were not the servants of a king, as their fathers might have been. They were citizens of France, defenders of a republic that had overturned centuries of aristocratic order and offered the world a different way of organizing human society. Some believed this deeply. Others believed it because believing it made the marching and the cold and the dead easier to endure. Either way, it functioned. The revolutionary language was printed on cartridge boxes, inscribed on cannon barrels, woven into the speeches Napoleon gave before battles that would cost thousands of lives. He was a practitioner of symbolism with an almost cynical mastery, and he knew that a soldier who believed he was fighting for something larger than himself would advance through fire that a soldier fighting merely for wages would refuse. By the winter of 1807, after the crushing of Prussia at Jena and Auerstadt, after the treaties that made France the unquestioned master of continental Europe, the machine had done what Napoleon had built it to do: From the Channel to the borders of Russia, no army had been able to stand in its path. Other powers studied it with a combination of terror and desperate admiration. Prussia began reforming its own army on French principles within months of its defeat, knowing that the old way of fighting had ceased to exist the moment Napoleon's corps appeared on multiple roads simultaneously. What one man had assembled from the wreckage of revolution, the conscript armies, the corps structure, the meritocratic officers, the standardized artillery, the regimental loyalties, the propaganda, the relentless speed, had not merely won battles. It had redesigned the nature of war itself, and the world that emerged from those campaigns would carry the shape of that redesign for a century still to come.